Mindsetters, welcome to today's Grade 10 Life Sciences show. Today we have a special revision lesson on structure and support in animals. We have selected highlights from lessons shown early in the term to help you revise and prepare for your June exams. You can download the notes for today's show from learnextra.co.za/live. Now it's time to get on with today's lesson. Please post your comments and questions on our Facebook page on facebook.com/learnextra or on Twitter @learnextra so we can help you with your revision.
So very quickly, in this session, let's look at the different types of skeletons. So when we look at the different types of skeletons, there are three different types. We're going to look at the three different types, and each one, we're going to look at them differently. We're going to look at some diagrams of them, and then we're going to compare them. So the first type is hydrostatic skeleton. Now, obviously, if you break this up here, hydro refers to water, and you'd obviously know this from being in class. Hydroskeleton, hydrolysis refers to water. Here, hydrostatic skeleton. So static would be referred to a system that is constant, does not move. So we're not saying that these skeletons do not move, but it refers to a skeleton that receives support from water. Now, hydrostatic skeletons has body compartments or tubes that are filled with water, and this water provides pressure, and the pressure obviously gives the organism shape. So if you think about, and a classical example to explain this is, if you have a balloon and if you fill that up with water, it obviously doesn't have any shape initially, so it's looking all, and as soon as you blow that up or fill it with water, if you plug in a hose pipe there or a little pipe, it swells up, and that single balloon has got now support, and it's got shape, and that support comes from basically the expansion of the balloon is caused by the water inside applying pressure on it. Now, it's a very similar concept that animals that have a hydrostatic skeleton undergo. So they have a system of body tubes, and these body tubes, guys, fill up with water. So if you think about a classical animal to look at is an earthworm, okay, and obviously there's water that goes into the body that applies pressure, and that pressure is called hydrostatic pressure, and that pressure is applied against the tubes, the walls of the tubes, that gives the animal shape. Okay, so this gives enough support as well as protection for the invertebrates, and the term invertebrates obviously refers to organisms that do not have a cranium or a skull and a backbone. So we refer to, and it'll be a characteristic of animals that don't have a vertebral column, having either a hydrostatic skeleton or the next type, which is an exoskeleton. And these organisms will need to live either in water or in moist environments. That means in soil that is waterlogged, or in soil that has a high humus content or water content, simply so that they could absorb water, and that water provides the shape necessary for their body. So we find that sea snails, anemones, jellyfish, all have tubes in their body that fill up with water. Even an octopus, guys, if you take an octopus out of water, which is a bad thing to do, you find that it loses body shape. Why? Because it gets dehydrated. And that's essentially what happens. The water in the body provides pressure within the tubes. The system of tubes swell up, giving the organism its shape. Okay, a classical example of organisms that of an animal or an organism that has a hydrostatic skeleton is the earthworm. And here is a nice pretty diagram, and you'll find that you tend to see lots of earthworms after rain. They tend to be in moist soil, so they're not going to be in your garden if your garden is dry. They're not going to be right in the top. They're going to be burrowing deep into the ground. And here you see earthworms. You see an earthworm with, obviously it has a segmented body, and each segment obviously function as a separate balloon. So you've got one segment, and another segment, and another one, and we go on. So each of these segments fill up with water, and the water is applying pressure, and that pressure provides shape, as well as it gives the organism some amount of protection. And that shape is very important to these organisms. They're able to move about, bring about movement, and that happens through contraction and expansion of different segments in the body simultaneously, or alternatively moving and creating shape. So animals that live on land in moist environments can have an hydrostatic skeleton, which is a body tube filled up with water. We find this in worms as well. Again, here's an example of a worm, and you'll see this. It's got a system of, it's segmented, and each segment, sorry, I need to change the color of my pen. Here you can see lots of segments that make up this organism, and each segment obviously functions as a separate compartment, and in there you find that they've got tissue fluid, body fluid, not necessarily water as such, but body fluid that is largely composed of water, and that composition actually applies pressure, giving the organism shape and allowing the organism to be able to move. Okay, so that's the hydrostatic skeleton. The next type of skeleton we're looking at is the exoskeleton. I'm going to break the word up exo into two parts. Exo meaning exterior. Okay, so it's the exterior skeleton, simply meaning that it's a skeleton, or it's a support system that is found externally outside the body. Okay, so, and I'm sure you probably have seen many examples of animals that have an exoskeleton. So the exoskeleton support system is made up of, it's chitinous, made up of chitin or calcareous. Now basically chitin and calcareous are deposits of minerals from the environment that strengthen the exoskeleton. And you'll see this in the example when we're looking at next, which is a classical example that I enjoy using are crabs. And here you can see a hard exoskeleton made up of calcareous or chitinous. Chitin would be in insects. You'll see your locust, the grasshoppers, the spiders, lots of the arachnids, the cockroaches. They have an external chitinous exoskeleton. And obviously this forms a hard body covering which protects, and that's external on the outside, and that's the reason why we use exo. And this provides the animal with support. And very importantly, it provides also support and protection. Remember that the delicate organs, the muscles, are located within the internal skeleton, and these muscles need to be protected. And that is done through having an exoskeleton. We find that all invertebrate arthropods, such as insects, your crustaceans, your arachnids, all have an exoskeleton. Okay, and that exoskeleton provides support, provides for the attachment of muscles and ligaments, as well as it provides protection to the organism. We're going to look at the diagrams here. So here you can see these are images of crabs, and here you see the carapace, and it's hard. And I'm sure if you've been to the beach or along a river, you'd see that they tend to burrow into the soil. They tend to dig into the sand as well at the beach. They can defend themselves. They withdraw their body close by when they're in danger, and they rely on that tough external chitinous calcareous outer covering to give them support. And this is basically strengthened by deposits from the sea that solidifies and hardens the exoskeleton. Okay, we would talk about what happens, the need for them to constantly molt or get rid of that exoskeleton to grow. And when we get to the advantages and disadvantages of this, we will talk about it. But I'm sure as you walked along the beach, sometimes you would have noticed that there are empty shells. I'm not too sure if you've noticed that, Blooney, but sometimes you see empty shells. You see sometimes empty shells of snails.
And then
and
you
that
pick them up and keep them.
Yeah, some people tend to collect them and keep them. So those shells basically were, if we recall that, the exoskeleton of some of your aquatic invertebrates. And because they need to grow, you find that the animals tend to molt or shed away the external covering so that a new body covering, a softer body covering, grows off, and that then becomes solidified to form a new problem. So it spends lots of time shedding, molting, so that they can produce a new covering, and that is a disadvantage in itself. It does allow the animal to become susceptible. When it's got a vulnerable, a softer outer covering, it is more likely to be attacked by other carnivorous animals. Okay, woodlice, and I'm sure you would have seen this in your gardens. If you've got dead, decaying wood around in your garden, you find that this is obviously a segmented body, but the body is offered protection by having the outer exoskeleton. And these animals are able to burrow into the wood, they get into the soil, and to some extent they're able to withstand the impact of being trampled on by other insects. So it does serve an important protective function. Here we're seeing, I'm not too sure if you guys have seen this, but this is a It's called a horseshoe crab, and it's regarded as a living fossil. Here we see a very tough outer carapace, something that scientists have believed, an organism that has remained, it's called a living fossil. It has remained relatively unchanged since it has been found. So there's lots of evidence of fossils that existed many million years ago that look like the horseshoe crabs that we presently find, which simply we imply, which an implication would be that these organisms have remained unchanged for a very long time. So we can clearly see that aquatic organisms that lived a long time ago relied on an exoskeleton for protection. These often are animals that scavenge the floor, crabs as well scavenge the floor of the seabed, and hence they need that protection on their upper body from the dangers of other carnivorous animals. Okay, here we're looking at, and you've probably seen lots of these in your garden, and I know you tend to, the first thing you tend to do is you go and you touch the tentacles and they withdraw and they go back into that little shell. Now here we're seeing a combination of two different skeletal systems. We're seeing the shell and we're seeing the body. Now, and I know that the body is a soft body. This body is obviously a hydrostatic skeleton. So the snail as such relies on the internal structure of tubes to fill up with water, and that provides it with support. The exoskeleton is the shell in which the snail can withdraw and uses as a temporary abode during its growth. And then as it outgrows this, it shreds it and it moves into a new shell or secretes a new shell. And that is essentially how the exoskeleton provides support and more, as well as attachment for muscles and movement. Okay, we're going to look at the third type, and obviously this is the I wouldn't say the most important, but this is something that we need to obviously look at in great detail, especially at going forward into the next lessons. So we're going to look at the last part of the three types of skeletons, and that is the endoskeleton. And obviously endo refers to something that is in the interior. So these skeletons would be found internally. So they're internally found. We don't tend to see them, but they are there. And obviously what we refer to as a human skeleton as an endoskeleton, or would be a type of endoskeleton. So when we look at an endoskeleton, the endoskeleton provides is a support system that is made up of soft or hard bones. So it could be a combination of soft bones and hard bones. And often people ask me, soft bones? Where would those be, Looney? Where would a soft bone be? Yes, we will look at them, but they're a combination of soft bones and hard bones. They also have, there are joints, muscles, there are presence of tendons as well as ligaments. And these are all found internally, and hence we use the word endo. And what is very important is that these different parts of the endoskeleton play a very important role in the successful movement and protection of terrestrial vertebrates. Now we're looking at vertebrates that live on land. We're not saying that animals that live in water or the aquatic ones do not have an endoskeleton. If we look at sharks, they have a cartilaginous endoskeleton made up of cartilage. If we look, so it's soft bones as such. If we look at whales, they also have an endoskeleton. So these are vertebrates that have skeletons, but they're found internally. So when we talk about endoskeletons, they're not limited to terrestrial organisms. They're found in aquatic organisms as well. But these aquatic organisms are large, they're massive, and they need a support system to give them shape. So they cannot rely on tubes to give their massive body shapes. They need a stronger system of bones or soft hard bones to give them shape. A soft endoskeleton is made up of cartilage, and you'll see that as in sharks. So we get certain sharks, and sharks are cartilaginous, and their body is made up of cartilage, and this gives them an advantage. And if you know that sharks, most of them are predatory, they're agile, they're swift, they can turn fast, their body is light compared to bigger organisms. This allows them to be successful predators. And you know that in the sea, the shark tends to be the king of the sea. He's dominant, he can attack, he's swift, they're agile, and that's because of having soft cartilaginous bones. And that simply means that the body weight is reduced. It's a remarkable adaptation for sharks being successful hunters in the sea. The fact that they've got a body system that is made up of cartilage. The closest you can get to understanding the type of cartilage that they have would be the cartilage that you have in your ear, in your nose tips as well. And that's essentially with the type of cartilage that they have. It's soft, flexible, and if you think about a shark, how quickly it can turn, attack its prey, and that's the adaptation of having a soft endoskeleton. A hard endoskeleton is made up of bone, as we see in vertebrates. Endoskeleton protects the soft body tissue and it allows for free movement, greater growth and strength. If you think about humans, or if you think about animals that have an endoskeleton, you know that we have considerable amount of flexibility in terms of the way we can walk. If you think about animals that can stretch, they have larger wingspans, they can extend their arms, they can extend their legs, they can grip very easily. They move freely. There's free movement. And you know that and contortionists, if that's the word, they can flex their body, they can bend their arms. Animals have the same ability to allow free movement, and that is because of the presence of bones internally. If you try to do that with a crab, it's very hard for them to flex their bones because they are limited by that external covering, making it very difficult for them to move very easily. And hence, if you looked at a crab and if you look at it defending itself, it tends to bring its body in line with the predator, and that is obviously to try and put the exoskeleton between him or between the crab and the predator. We tend to run, we tend to protect ourselves, and that's it. Greater growth and strength. Having a skeleton internally allows us to grow freely. We don't need to molt, we don't need to shred our exoskeleton to grow. We grow easily, we grow faster, and we tend to have more strength. And that strength is not necessarily because of the bones, but it's a system of bones and muscles that function as levers that bring about, and we call the term mechanical advantage joints, that create more movement, that create strength to the support system. Okay, so here a classical vertebrate, you can see it's got a head, it's got a vertebral column, and it's got the appendages that we spoke about. We're going to look at different types of skeletons. We're going to look at the human skeleton next week, and we will dissect up, not a human skeleton, but we will dissect up a skeleton system in terms of a model as a friend that I promise I'm going to bring. Here's an image of a frog. Again, here you can clearly see the presence of bones. You can see that it's got a vertebral column, the skull, the vertebral column, and here. What you know about a frog, it's small, it's highly flexible, they can jump, and the ability for it to jump is enhanced by a system of levers and bones and muscles that bring about that flexibility and increased movement. So think about most of your land vertebrates. They're able to move fast, and that movement is brought about by the attachment of muscles internally to these bones.
Okay guys, I hope you're enjoying this revision session. If you are struggling and need help, remember to post on the page or send an email to helpdesk@learnextra.co.za. We have got such exciting news for you. From July, a new program starts on Mindset, just for you. It's called Connections. We'll chat about the issues that affect your life, your school, and your relationships. We'll have fun, take your calls, and have great prizes up for grabs. Connections, from the 1st of July, 7:30 in the evening, only on Mindset. For you, by you. Welcome back from the break. I know you can't wait for the term to end and the July holidays to start. And of course, that means winter school. This year, we will be repeating all the Term 2 Learn Extra live shows for you from the 24th till the 28th of June from 9 a.m. in the morning till 7 p.m. at night. So don't miss out. Go to our website www.mindset.co.za/learn/extra/winter school to get all the details and to download the notes for each lesson. But for now, let's get back to today's revision lesson. Over to you.
Before we start, we spoke about the cranium and that the skull was made up of many different bones. Here, if we look at the cranium of a human skeleton, this is obviously Mr. Bones. We've just taken his skull off. And here we clearly see sutures or sort of little stitches. And this is an indication of bones that were initially movable. And as you'd see here, I've got a little enlarged model of it. And these bones, guys, if you move these apart, and you clearly see sort of a very serrated edge, and these look like stitches. These bones at one stage were fused, or are fused. They become fused, but initially they were movable. And the reason why they're movable is that, Katlika, would you be able to guess why they're movable during birth process?
Yeah, so that the skull becomes smaller.
Absolutely.
Or compressed.
And you notice that often parents talk about being very gentle with babies. It's because these bones have not yet fused. Once these bones fuse, and that happens after about 3 or 4 years, these joints become immovable, and they're now known as sutures. So they play a very important role, and the reason why they're movable is important in the birth process. You'd see these typical sutures even in the skeleton, the skulls of other animals as well. A very characteristic of the ability of these bones to move is to facilitate the birth process. Okay, so that's that. We also need to look at a very important structure which I've included in the notes, which is called the foramen magnum, and this is the hole at the base of the skull. And if we look at the hole at the base of the skull, basically, this is what allows the vertebral column to connect to the skull, and within the vertebral column is situated the spinal cord. So the spinal cord attaches to the brain, and it's protected within the vertebral column. And this little opening is called the foramen, refers to the opening, and obviously it's called magnum, which relates to the opening of the skull, which allows the vertebral column to enter. What is very important is also to understand the position of the foramen magnum in relation to the skull. I mentioned earlier on that we are bipedal, that means we stand upright. The position of this foramen magnum is a significant movement, a significant characteristic of human skeletons or animals that stand upright. By looking at the position of this, we can tell whether the animal was bipedal or walked occasionally bipedal or was on all four. Now, I've got also the skull of, let's see, we've got the skull of, let's see, I'm going to try and see something that's a bit more clear. This is of an otter, and here you see, okay, we're going to look at the structure, but you look at the foramen magnum. This is at the base. This is at the back of the skull. If you compare that to the human skull, okay, very quickly I'm going to grab this. If we're going to compare the positions of here, we've got it at the base, and here we've got it at the back of the head. This will clearly indicate that this animal had the vertebral column running along a horizontal axis, and hence the opening at the back of the brain. And this will tell you that at the base, the organism stood upright. It's very important for you to be able to make that decision or look at the structure to be able to make that conclusion. And we will use this characteristic as we get into grade 10, 11, and 12, when we understand how organisms move from being walking on all four to becoming occasionally bipedal to being totally bipedal. So a very important characteristic of the foramen magnum. Another characteristic we spoke about is the zygomatic arch. If we look at the zygomatic arch, basically the cheekbone, we see it's not as prominent as in some other animals. Here we've got a replica of a fossil of, this is Homo habilis, and here you clearly see very, very prominent zygomatic arches. Now, just by looking at the zygomatic arch, guys, if you compare the two, obviously there's a size difference, but in terms of it being more pronounced, you can clearly see a very pronounced zygomatic arch. And that actually tells us that this specimen, this form of ancestral Homo habilis relied or ate a lot of meat. It relied on its strong jaws, and it needed the attachment of strong muscles to be able to crush and process its food. So a distinct feature of animals showing the development of the lower jaw would be the presence of a pronounced zygomatic arch. We also see the raised eyebrow ridges, which we talk about in greater detail in grade 12. Okay, we spoke about the types of teeth. Here, if we looked at, here you see in the otter, we're seeing very pronounced, these are your incisors, the teeth that are used for biting, and you know that otters tend to bite, and they would, and that's very important for them. But if you look at the molars and premolars, so these are much less pronounced, and obviously they need to have, they need to be able to chew and process their food. So if you compare them to their incisors, they rely on the incisors for being able to bite, and they chew with their molars and premolars. If we compare that to the ox, which is very, very, very big, we see that you don't clearly see, the incisors obviously have fallen off, but you see distinct molars and premolars. And the reason why they're bigger, and obviously because they spend lots of time chewing their food, you see that these bones are much more pronounced. They're more distinct as compared to these are your canines, and I'm not too sure if you're going to go and stand next to a cow and obviously entice it to bite you. It's not, because these bones are not going to be of any use to them. But definitely they play a very important role in chewing. Okay. We also spoke about the vertebral column. Here we've got and if we compare that to the vertebral column of a human, this would be, if I were to hold this upright, which would not be a good representation, this organism would be that of an ox. You see these would be the lumbar region, and then we go on to the sacral region and the coccyx. But obviously they have a tail, so you find that the coccygeal bones, this continues into the tail, and they're able to move their tail. And here you see, we call this the neural spine, and we refer to these as the transverse processes. And these transverse processes are obviously there for the attachment of the muscles. The neural arch is there for the attachment of the muscles onto the backbone. What you see here is the opening, and the opening through which the spinal cord runs. So the spine runs through the spinal opening, and it is protected within that cavity. We also see, I've got another vertebrae, and here you can clearly see the transverse processes. And the body of the vertebrae is called the centrum, and it is the strength, it is the solid part of this that actually supports the weight of the animal. So the lumbar vertebrae in humans have a pronounced, bigger centrum, and that's because they support the mass of the body. We also see distinct processes for the attachment of the muscles in the ribs. Here we see the neural arch. And if we compare that to the animals like dinosaurs that have a distinct neural arch, and that was for the attachment of strong muscles in the back. We don't really need that. It also offered them added support and protection in their back. Here we see articular facets, and by that I mean surfaces which articulate with vertebrae that are in front and at the back. So these are facets onto which the vertebrae attach, and they're able to bring about movement. Between the vertebrae are intervertebral discs, guys, and these play a very important role in bringing about movement as well as absorbing the shock from mechanical movement. So that's a typical vertebrae that we would see in a larger vertebrate. Here I've got a vertebrae, and I spoke about the atlas. And if we look at the atlas, guys, no distinct neural spine. And the reason why it's not distinct is because we can clearly rotate our necks, and that's because of lack of that. The transverse processes are less pronounced. We have a larger opening, a foramen, and that's for the passage of the spinal cord through it. So these are the two, this is one of them. We have the atlas and the axis that collectively bring about the rotation of the neck. Let's see. We also have in front of me is I've got the last two regions of the vertebral column. We call that the sacral region and the coccyx. And lots of my learners ask me, so but why are these bones fused? Is that an indication that we once had a tail? And that's a possibility that we can infer based on the transitions and some similarities we see in other vertebrates. So obviously these bones have been fused, so which at one stage were a tail, which we've lost the function of. They've become fused together, and so these are the 5 sacral, and you've got the 4 coccyx bones in the coccygeal region. No neural spines, and obviously that's because we don't have predominant muscles that need to move the tail as such. Let's see. So the other bones that we're going to talk about is, I'm going to go back to, this is our friend Mr. Bones, and we referred to the skeleton as having an axis that's a vertical plane along which we found the skull, we found the thoracic or the rib cage, and we've got the girdles. If we turn around, guys, we can clearly see the pectoral girdle, which is made up of the triangular scapula, and then you've got your clavicle, which is the collarbone here, and that's an S-shaped bone. In the glenoid cavity, we find the head of the femur rotating in there. You've got the radius, the ulna, the carpals, the metacarpals, and the phalanges. If we look at the lower body, we've got your pelvic girdle made up of the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. And what is characteristic of the pubis would be during birth is that it has the ability to move apart slightly so that it can facilitate the process of birth. If we compare the pelvic girdles of males and females, we'll see that there is a distinct difference in the shape of these. Females tend to have a more bucket-shaped pelvic girdle. The coccyx region tends to be a bit further back, and that's basically to facilitate the process of birth. In the lower legs, in the limbs, we've got the longus bone, which is the femur. We've got the patella or the kneecap. We've got the tibia and the fibula. We've got your tarsals, metatarsals, and your phalanges. So that's a very quick look at it. What I wanted to point out was the ribs, and we spoke about your true ribs. We also can see we've got your ribs that are called the false ribs, and that's because you can clearly see a point of attachment together, and these fuse then to the sternum. And here you see your floating ribs, which have no direct attachment to the sternum.
Now it's time for a break, so don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back, Mindsetters. In case you missed my news, starting in July, we have a new program that is going to get you talking. What's on your mind? What are the issues you deal with? How can we help you? Connections will help you with all that and more, so make sure you catch it. For a fun and youthful look at life, connect with us on Connections. But right now, let's do some more revision.
All right, in front of me over here, you will see, right, I have an animal's long bone, all right? And when we need to go look at the structure of it. Now, you'll see here, I've got this isn't my little Stanley Jr. It's just a little, all right, it's a bit of a mission to carry the big one around. So where do we find long bones? We find long bones in our limbs. So we're going to find it in our arms and in our legs, okay? So it's going to be the humerus, the ulna, and the radius in our arms, and in our legs, the femur, the tibia, and the fibula. Now remember, these ones are long because they're also going to be big, because they're the ones that are going to do the most work when it comes to movement. Also, if we look at our legs, they need to be nice and strong because they need to have a supportive function. Remember, your bones are going to support your body. Okay, let's have a look here. I'm going to leave little Stanley Jr. over there. Let's have a look at the structure of the long bone. If we look at it, I'm going to turn it over it. This is a bone that a colleague of mine actually left in the veld, all right? And the ants ate everything up and cleaned it all up, and actually we have a nice now preserved bone. Otherwise, sometimes when you cook it or you heat it, it can destroy it. When you look at the bone, all right, the first thing that should become apparent is that there's a long, straight piece over here, a long piece, and at the end we almost have two heads. Okay? Now, this long portion over here is called the diaphysis. Okay? Diaphysis. That's the long, narrow portion of the bone. It's also the strongest portion, as we'll see just now, because it's the weight-bearing portion. At the top are the two heads of the long bone, and we call those the epiphysis. Okay? So we have a diaphysis and we have an epiphysis. So that's the shaft. Okay, we don't always use the word shaft. It's preferable to use diaphysis, and then the heads, preferably to use again the epiphysis. All right, a little bit difficult to remember, to spell, but don't worry, you'll get the hang of it. Now, if we look inside, right, you can see some of the ants are still here. If we have a look at the bone, all right, you will actually see here, if we look inside, there is the epiphysis, all right, on that side, and there is the shaft, the diaphysis. If we look at the different bones, we can actually notice that the structure of the epiphysis and the diaphysis is slightly different, okay? The epiphysis over here is made up of what we call spongy bone. Now, spongy bone, you can imagine the sponge that you might use in the bath. It's got a lot more holes in it, if I can use hole. If I can be biological, it's more solid. All right, it's not as solid, sorry, should I say. So it's got more spaces in between. That's why we call it spongy bone, right? Because there is a lot more of those spaces. In between those spaces, and you can't see it here because the ants have had a lovely good munchy munch on here, you are going to find something that you call bone marrow, okay? Bone marrow. And in the heads, the epiphysis, you find your red bone marrow. Now, if you can remember back to your mammalian tissue, red bone marrow and your yellow bone marrow are responsible for making your blood cells, okay? Your red blood cells and your white blood cells, your erythrocytes and your leukocytes. So the bone here doesn't have as much of a supportive function. If we have a look now at the diaphysis, you will see, look here, you can see it, you almost see it, looks like a bit like you want to just can poke it. But if you have a look at the diaphysis, you can't see the same shape, and that is because that is made up of compact bone. Compact bone does not have the spaces that we find in the epiphysis. As the word says, compact, very, 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 very close together. And we want that, all right? Because my diaphysis, that's where my load occurs. In other words, that's where I put my, that is where my, where all my weight is going to be. This is where I'm going to attach my muscles. And my muscles over here, if they pull, we don't want it to be able to pull apart, okay? So this part needs to be strong. Now, if we look, you'll see there's nothing inside here but a hollow, okay? That would be the medullary cavity. Okay, so what do we find in here? The bone marrow, and we find inside that it's hollow because that's where the bone marrow is going to sit. Now remember, those of you who, when we did cells, you would have also talked about stem cells. And one of the things is when they harvest, that's what they're trying to get. Those stem cells that are inside the bones that can then make new blood cells. Then if we go outside again, all right, you will see over here, if I pull this over here, the bone is surrounded by a nice, tough, fibrous outer layer, and that is called the periosteum. All right, so we'll say it again, the periosteum. Remember, os, when we use the word os, that always refers to bone. And the periosteum on the outside makes the bone nice and firm. On the inside, all right, you can't see it as much, but it's nice and smooth. The bones inside here is smooth, and that is a layer that's not as tough as the one on the outside, all right? But there we go. If we look inside here, if you feel it, you can't really see it. You need to feel it, all right? It's nice and smooth, and that is called the endosteum. Remember, anything inside is endo. So that is the endosteum. Os, again, meaning bone. Okay, so we got the epiphysis, we got the diaphysis, we've got the medullary cavity with the bone marrow inside. The lining on the inside is called the endosteum. The lining on the outside is called the periosteum. Now, if you have a look at this, at the heads over here, I'm going to show you this one over here. If you have a look, next time, I always tell my kids, next time you have a chicken bone, all right? A chicken bone is such a wonderful thing because nearly all of the mammalian tissues are there, and obviously the bone. Next time you have a chicken bone, when you have the chicken bone, I'm sure all of you at the ends of the bone, all right, there's that little white piece, okay, that is nice and smooth. That is called hyaline cartilage. If you can remember back when we did connective tissue, all right, hyaline cartilage is covering the epiphysis. It covers the ends of the long bones. It makes them nice and smooth. If you can see it here, it's nice and smooth. Now, that brings us, all right, to when we start to look just now, we're going to look at joints. Now, if two bones are joined together, all right, that means they are going to move. And when they move, you obviously want the movement to be smooth. You don't want it to be all jerky, and if you've got friction, it's going to hurt. Okay, so over here you will see at the hyaline cartilage, go and play with your chicken bone next time. All right, go and have a look at that white. Feel it, you'll see it's nice and smooth. On the other side over here, some of the meat is still attached, so you can't see it as much. There we go. All right, that's going to be your hyaline cartilage. Nice and smooth. The word we use there is also lubrication and for protection. So you don't want, if the bones do somehow slide next to each other, you want the bones to be protected. In this layer over here, you won't be able to see it now, all right, is going to be blood vessels, because the blood vessels need to nourish the bone. Okay, so if we have to look again, epiphysis, diaphysis, the bone marrow inside the medullary cavity, the endosteum inside, the periosteum on the outside, and what we usually find, the word that people sometimes use is, you might use the word articular cartilage. Articulate means when two things join, they articulate. So with this bone, and if, all right, is going to join to another bone, as you can see, all right, if you have a look at it, if it joins to another bone, what's going to happen? It articulates. So the cartilage between the two bones would then be articulating cartilage. Okay, now which brings us to the next section. If we have a look at Stanley again over here, all right, you will notice that the bones are joined to each other. So you will have a look here. There's a, from the olden days, there's a song. I'm sure you know, the hip bone's connected to the leg bone. But all the bones are connected. The only bone that isn't connected to another bone is our patella. All right. Over here, if I bring the knee joint across and I turn it over there, as you can see, let me get it around. Okay, there's your patella, your kneecap. It doesn't articulate or join with any of the others. Okay, now, when we're looking at joints, what do we say? A definition of joints is when two bones, right, are joined together. So when we have the connection of two bones together, that is going to form a joint. Now, if you have a look at little Stanley over here, and if you have a look at some of the examples that I've brought, you should notice that some of the joints are able to move a lot more freely than others. So once again, as I said earlier, we like to classify bones into different shapes. We also are now going to classify joints into different, all right, classes. Carrying on from our structure of the long bone, we were looking at joints. And as we said, a joint, the definition of a joint, is when two or more bones are joined together, right, by some kind of connective tissue. Now, as I said, that we like to classify joints into different categories. And we do that according to the movement that they allow. Okay, so let us start with the first one. I'm going to bring old Stanley here. All right, you won't see it too clearly, but I'm sure you can remember. Our first joints are immovable. They cannot move. They are bound very tightly together, all right, by tough, thick, fibrous connective tissue, because when, say, for example, we're looking at the skull, when the baby comes out of, all right, the uterus, and its head needs to be able to, the bones of the skull need to be able to fold in so it can come out of the birth canal. So, and only later, after it, all right, couple of months, almost to a year, and that those bones then need to start to fuse. And we need to have something that can't move, because the most important thing is that our skull is there to protect our brain. So that is called a fibrous joint. Okay, the first one, immovable, that is called a fibrous joint. It cannot move, right? And that's the sutures of the skull. Remember, when you look at the skull, it almost looks like you've taken like a sewing kit and sewed them together. We don't want them to move. We don't want our brain to move around in there. Our second joint, so now you should be able to guess. Our second joint is joints that are able to move slightly. So, although they are quite stable, right, they allow slight amount of movement when necessary, but they still are not freely movable. You will see in front of me over here, I have the vertebral column, and when we look at the vertebral column, each of the bones is separated by cartilage, cartilaginous joints, all right? Fibrous joints, immovable, cartilaginous joints. So these are our intervertebral discs. And it's these discs, all right, that allows the vertebral column to have slight movement. We do need to have some kind of flexibility when it comes, right, to our vertebral column, but we also need to have, right, if you think of them, they also shock absorption, all right? They're there to protect the bones. Anybody who's had a slipped disc or a herniated disc is when this intervertebral disc, part of it kind of pops out, right? But we're not going to talk about that now. So our intervertebral disc, and also if we have a look at Stanley again, you won't see it too clearly, but between the hip bones, all right? Remember that we have two hip bones and they are articulate, they join in the front by the pubic symphysis, okay? So not a lot of a movement, but you need slight movement, especially during childbirth, etc., where you need the hips to be able to have some kind of give. Which leads us then to our last joint. So we've had, all right, we've had our skull, the sutures, the immovable ones, okay, fibrous joints. We had our cartilaginous joints, where slight movement was permitted, which then brings us to what we call our synovial joints. And I'm going to do the structure of a synovial joint just now on the board with you, but I want to just show you, right, the different types of synovial joints that you can get. A synovial joint, there we go, if I move my knee, if I move the elbow joint, okay, and if I move the hip joint, what you should have noticed is they all did exactly that. They moved. So my synovial joints are joints that are able to move. Okay? They are what we call freely movable joints. And as I said just now, I'm going to look at the structure for you. Okay, if we have a look at our synovial joint, you will see because there is movement, certain structures are going to be far more evident. Now, when we look over here, you're going to see, as I said, I brought in different kinds of joints. Once again, we also classify synovial joints into what the different movement allows in that particular section as well. So we have synovial means freely movable joint, and then we've got different kinds of joints within that classification. The one that is the most freely movable is what we call the ball and socket joint. If you have a look, the hip, all right, the hip has got a socket, which is almost like a groove. And into that, all right, if we have a look over there, you'll see my epiphysis again. It's a head, it's a knob. So if I've got a groove and then I've got a socket that moves inside there, I am then able, ball, socket joint, it is then able to rotate and actually give me quite a lot of movement. A lot more if I had to move my arm around like that. All right, my shoulder joint is also ball and socket joint, gives me a large range of movement. So if my shoulder can do that, obviously my hip, not all of us are that flexible, but my hip would also be. Our next joint is our hinge. The hinge is just exactly like the door hinge. A door can do one thing. It can open or close. That's it. That's exactly what my knee and my elbow can do. If we have a look over here, okay, it can extend or it can flex. So if I were to do this, there we go, straighten my arm, bend my arm, straighten my arm. This moving around like that, that's not my elbow doing the work. That's my shoulder doing the work. All right? The same goes for my knee. Okay? My knee can bend my leg or it can straighten my leg. It can't twist it all around. If if you have a look at all these little plastic things going around, we're going to look at that just now as well. Those are ligaments. And if we twist it, we can actually tear it. And those are where we get torn ligaments and sprains and those kind of things. So when we look at our joint, hinge joint, ball and socket joint, there are another two that we're going to look at. We're going to look at the head, where at the skull, at the bottom of the skull, our very first vertebral column, what do we find? The atlas and the axis. And remember, when you did it last week, they fit into each other, all right? The odontoid peg fits into the atlas, and it can rotate. And that helps me, all right, to roll my head, to pivot, right, to turn around in a circle. The last one is it's a bit difficult to explain because it's something that's very, very slight, and that is what we call a gliding joint. And the bones of the wrist do that. They slowly, just slightly glide past each other. So when I rotate, even though it looks like I'm rotating, the bones don't actually rotate, right? They slide next to each other.
We've come to the end of today's show. Thanks for joining me and for chatting to me during the show. Remember to join us for winter school from the 27th till the 30th of June, when we will be repeating all the Learn Extra live shows from Term 2. We'll be back with live shows from the 15th of July for Term 3 lessons.